final session is on consciousness and psilocybins, and we have two very interesting talks on psilocybin mushrooms. And in fact, if you look under your seat, you'll find a little baggie with some mushrooms. No. I wish. All right. The first speaker is Katherine McLean from Johns Hopkins. She's a PhD in psychiatry and behavioral sciences. She studied at Dartmouth, and she was at Davis. She's done a lot of very interesting work, and she's got, oh, and let me just say that the two speakers have asked that we hold questions for the end, unless there's very specific technical questions after Katherine's talk about the methodology. So she's going to speak on psilocybin and personality change. Let's welcome Katherine McLean.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank the organizers. And Robin just told me he actually saw into the future, and something amazing is going to happen today. So I'm so glad you all stayed for it. I always like to start off by thanking my mentors, the people who I feel like I'm representing when I talk about my research. Roland Griffiths at Hopkins was very courageous when he started this research back up about a decade ago, along with Bill Richards, who had been doing clinical work with psychedelics for a long time. Mary Casamano has been there since the beginning, Matt Johnson, various others who have come through our study team at Hopkins, and also I'd like to thank my mentors for being extreme skeptics and encouraging me to be very rigorous in trying to study consciousness, as well as all the funders. Hopefully we'll get some more government funders in that list soon. Okay, so psychedelics are back. I'm sure some of you are wondering where they went, and maybe they didn't go anywhere. I have the exclamation point there for a reason. No one really seems to feel very neutral about psychedelics. You either hate them or you love them, and I'm on neither extreme. I just think they're a really useful tool for studying brain function and consciousness, and hopefully kind of trying to tie those two sides together. I also like to start with an overview so that then it's up to you how much you want to pay attention, but you can get everything that I'm about to talk about right here. So psychedelics cover a broad range of conscious experiences. There are many ways to study them. The focus that we've taken at Hopkins is looking at this thing called a mystical experience or a spiritual experience. And this is kind of coming from their traditional use in indigenous cultures as a sacrament for spiritual purposes. And essentially what we found is that in healthy, well-prepared individuals who are spiritually inclined, psilocybin produces reliably a mystical or spiritual experience better than an active control drug and in a dose-related way. Not only does it produce these mystical experiences, but they have long-term positive effects on behaviors, attitudes, meaning, and interpersonal relationships more than a year after a single high-dose session. When I arrived at Hopkins about 2.5 years ago, I was very interested in some of these domains in psychology where we have really standard, reliable measures, such as personality. And personality is something that people don't think really changes, although more people are beginning to show that it can change. You just have to know when to measure it. And essentially we found that only a particular domain of personality changed after the high-dose psilocybin session, and that was called openness, so I'll talk more about that. And those increases also persisted more than a year after the session, suggesting some kind of permanent shift. And then I'll kind of end with some discussion of what this means for continued basic science research, therapeutic applications, and I'll hopefully cover world peace too. Okay, so there are probably some of you in the audience who are much better experts at history and the history of psychedelic use than me. Kind of suffice it to say, there has been a long history of indigenous use of psilocybe mushrooms, which is the genus of mushrooms that that psilocybin is the psychoactive component of. And kind of taking a broad anthropological perspective, it's probably more normal that these compounds were used for spiritual purposes, for consciousness exploration, and as tools for gaining knowledge about the world than it is our kind of current conception of them as these kind of weird drugs of abuse that that seem to cause problems for some people and seem to be life-changing for others. I've just included a couple images suggesting that psilocybin mushrooms had a really important role in some of these indigenous cultures going back as far back as 8,000 BC. The picture kind of in the middle here, if you can see my cursor, this is called the bee man, and I guess if you're looking for mushrooms in this picture, you could kind of see that it looks like he's holding some and he's kind of adorned with them around his body. You could probably also think that those are other things as well. So the historical record isn't totally clear, but at least more recently in Central America, it is fairly clear that psilocybin mushrooms, as well as other compounds, were used by shamans and in certain religious rituals. Of course, when the Spanish missionaries got to Mexico, they documented the ritual use of psilocybin among the Aztec people and then promptly tried to totally erase any history, any use of that compound by the indigenous folks. When Gordon Wasson and his wife Valentina went down to Mexico, they kind of rediscovered the mushrooms, but it was still a very underground practice, and it had been kind of turned into this mix of Christian and traditional religion. And so Gordon came back and published his account in Life magazine in 1957, which kind of began the scientific interest in psychedelics in the West. There's been kind of a brief burst of scientific research from the late 50s until about the early 70s in the US and other countries. And then after that brief burst that was really productive, essentially everything went dormant when the US and world drug laws decided to schedule LSD and other related compounds at the most strict level, which means there's no medical use and there's high risk. So essentially the research in the US went dormant. There was still quite a lot of experimentation and clinical application that was essentially underground. And then in the 1990s, a few groups in Europe started the research back up. But it wasn't until about 2000 when Roland Griffiths and others at Hopkins initiated the first US study in decades, which was a randomized placebo-controlled trial in healthy humans. And I'm not good with visuals, but this very simple visual helps me kind of put in perspective what we think is kind of the story of psychedelics, which is that little red blip at the end, and the entire history of possible use in indigenous cultures. And so it seems to me that we can argue what then and now is. It's probably already all happened and it's happening, but it's what our little kind of frame right here is this tiny little snapshot. And you know, I'm excited that the research is starting up again. Who knows what it will hold in the future, but it seems very premature to make any decisions about what these tools can do for science, just looking at the last 50 years or so. In terms of terminology, hallucinogen is actually a pretty bad word for these compounds. It refers to kind of frank hallucinations of things that aren't, quote, really out there in the real world. And psychedelics often don't produce frank hallucinations. There's another word, psychotomimetic, that has actually produced a lot of really good, that kind of framework has produced quite a bit of really good research, but it implies that whatever happens to consciousness is inherently dangerous and maladaptive. Indeed, it mimics psychosis. Then you can see that there are a couple other terms. The last term, entheogen, is a fairly new term. And it's also not a great term, but it seems to capture this inherent quality that a lot of people experience on psychedelics, which is that it seems to have a divine or sacred nature. And that can be apart from whether you're religious or spiritual, but essentially kind of a feeling that this is more important, more meaningful, of more purpose than your normal, ordinary reality. So it's kind of from that entheogenic perspective that the research at Hopkins got started, and we were curious to know whether psilocybin actually produces spiritual experiences when you control for all the other possible factors that could lead to such an experience. So this is more than just the biochemical action of psilocybin. Set and setting, which is probably the best legacy of Timothy Leary, creating that kind of sense that your particular expectations, and then the context in which you use the compounds really matters. It matters for every drug that you might study. Psychopharmacologists have known this for a really long time, but it seems to matter in particular for psychedelics. And so if you create a ritualistic context and the person is expecting a spiritual experience and wants to be healed by these compounds, you're probably going to create a stronger likelihood of a spiritual experience. And this is our version of set and setting. This room looks exactly the same now as it did 10 years ago. We kind of took a little bit of a different approach. There was some work done in the early clinical work with psychedelics in Canada where they decided that it actually really mattered the room that the person was in, even if their eyes were closed most of the time, but that it was essentially safe and pleasing, and that there was art and kind of, you can see there's some religious iconography and statues. But the idea was to create a setting that would be more likely to produce a spiritual experience. We don't make any claims that the setting doesn't matter. We in fact think it matters quite a bit. And I'll explain why we can kind of tease apart the setting from the actual drug effect in just a second. Okay, so the two studies that have been done in healthy volunteers over the last decade, the first study was essentially, for those of you who know the Good Friday experiment, Walter Pahnke and others at Harvard gave psilocybin to half of a group of theology students on Good Friday in the Marsh Chapel, and half got an active control drug. Everyone took the drugs together, so it wasn't really blind in that once the psilocybin effects kicked in, everyone knew who had gotten the drug and who hadn't. But he did show that psilocybin was capable of producing these mystical experiences that were no different than authentic spiritual experiences that have been documented across all religious traditions. So Roland and Bill Richards and the group at Hopkins at the time thought, well, let's just see if psilocybin is better than an active control drug at producing these mystical experiences. And the second study was building off of that study, looking at whether the mystical type effects of psilocybin increased in a dose-dependent way. You could imagine that if you have no effect versus some effect, well, the some effect might just produce the spiritual experience. And they were curious to know how closely it was related to the actual amount of psilocybin that the volunteers received. So let me talk just briefly about what a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized design means. It means that when you show up for your session, neither you nor the people in the room know anything about the study design, how much psilocybin you're going to get, what kind of drug you're going to get, and it's possible that you'll get nothing. Randomized means that even if there are some doses that are promised to be given at some point, you don't know in what order they'll be given. And this is actually essential in psychopharmacology because I guide volunteers through sessions, and I have expectations. If I knew what dose they were getting or what the general study design was, I could easily influence the results that they report. And same, of course, from the volunteer's perspective. So in the first study, there were 36 healthy adults from the Baltimore, DC area, all spiritually inclined. We can talk more about the participant sample. It's pretty homogeneous. The high dose of psilocybin was actually 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram, which is a very hefty recreational dose. And all of these people had never taken a hallucinogen before in their life. The control drug was Ritalin, and it turns out that Ritalin at a high enough dose is actually pretty good at mimicking some of the physiological and positive mood effects of psilocybin. In the second study, 18 healthy adults participated in 5 sessions across about 6 months, 1 month apart. And they were promised to get a high dose of psilocybin, same high dose, 30 milligrams at some point, but there could be other doses that were administered, anywhere from nothing, 0, total placebo, to up to 30. Half of the volunteers received an ascending dose, and half received a descending, meaning that the volunteers who received ascending could have started with a placebo or 5 milligrams, and then built up, and the other half could have started with 30 and then went down. Okay, so I wanted to share, I know that volunteers' words can speak a lot better about these experiences than necessarily our measures. So I wanted to share the story of a volunteer that I actually had the pleasure of working with in the study that we've been doing over the last couple of years at Hopkins. And what I want to emphasize from the start is this person is an extremely normal person, much more normal than anyone here. So he was certainly open-minded, interested in exploring his spirituality, but not necessarily the kind of person who might just kind of make up facts or really exaggerate what was going on. He's a young man about in his kind of early to mid-30s. He had a wife, very, kind of classic American upbringing, well-educated, but really, really average in most respects. So anyway, this is his narrative about his first session. In my mind's eye, I felt myself instinctively taking on the posture of prayer in my head. I was on my knees, hands clasped in front of me, and I bowed to this force. I wasn't scared or threatened in any way. It was more about reverence. I was showing my respect. I was humbled and honored to be in this presence. This presence was a feeling, not something I saw or heard. I only felt it, but it felt more real than any reality I've experienced. And it was a familiar place, too, one I had felt before. It was when I surrendered to this that I felt like I let go. I was gone, or should I say this earthly part of me was. It was still on the couch in some sort of suspended animation awaiting my return. I was in the void. This void had a strange and indescribable quality to it that there was nothing to it but this feeling of unconditional and undying love. It felt like my soul was basking in this feeling of this space. I have no idea how long this lasted. Time and space did not exist there, and there was no way of tracking it. I would have thought the music might remind me of the time, but at the point I felt like I was the music, or the music was me, or maybe that it was all different manifestations of this love feeling I found myself wrapped in. Sounds pretty good, huh? I chose to read that little section of his story because I think it helps me introduce how we quantify mystical experience. There are many ways you could quantify it, measure it, many variations of mystical experience. We're going from William Stace, kind of identifying certain core features of mystical experience across different biographical accounts, letters, journal, kind of personal diaries, that sort of thing. The primary feature is this idea of unity or interconnectedness. And this could mean unity with God if you believe in God. It could be unity with the universe. It could be unity with yourself, or even your surroundings. The other features that are present in these experiences, according to Stace, and our results seem to hold this up, are a sense of sacredness or reverence, a noetic quality. So you notice the volunteer talked about having a sense that it was as real or more real than waking life, that there was an intuitive knowledge that there's some kind of truth value to the experience. Positive mood, transcending time and space, and ineffability. Ineffability is kind of an alleged quality. Some people will claim that they can really describe these experiences, and other people not so much. So taking all these features that Stace defined, there are two questionnaire measures that pretty well capture these features. One is the Hood Mysticism Scale, which is usually used to quantify lifetime experiences, so across your whole life, and a Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which was developed by the lead author of the Good Friday experiment, that was specifically for a single drug or other type of intervention session. Okay, so all of that, and we get these kind of boring graphs, but basically what this shows, this is from the second study. This shows, so this is, if you see on the y-axis, this is mystical score. So higher means more mystical. And you can see that at placebo, we do a pretty good job of helping people feel like they're already in this mystical space to begin with. And then this is actually sub-threshold, a little bit stronger, and then you see this bump up at 20 and 30. The Hood scale is actually less sensitive to these immediate effects than the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. You can see this really nice increase across dose in mystical score. And remember, these people don't know what dose they're getting. So they're making these ratings right after the session. No one knows what dose they got, and you still get this really nice increase across very small amount difference in actual psilocybin. In the first study, 60% of volunteers at the high dose achieved what we call a complete mystical experience, which is a somewhat silly way of dichotomizing it, but it just means that basically all of those features are present to some to some level, to some degree. And in the second study, we did a better job, probably because 30 is a little bit overwhelming for some people. So more people had mystical experiences at the moderately high dose and not at the highest dose. But still, 60 to 70% is a pretty good number. And for those of you who are a little skeptical, it's not 100%, meaning that we're not fully capable of producing the mystical experience just because we want it to be there and because the volunteers want it to be there. The mystical experiences predict ratings that people made 14 months later. So all of these graphs at the top just show that this is, for example, spiritually significant experiences, positive behavior change, personal well-being. Methylphenidate, it's elevated, but it's a pretty low score. And 2 months after the psilocybin in yellow, and then 14 months again, the ratings are essentially unchanged, meaning how you felt 2 months after the session is essentially how you continue to feel more than a year later. And these people were spiritually inclined volunteers. They were not leading these spiritually impoverished lives. They had a strong sangha or community to go back to. They continued to explore their spirituality, and they were still looking back on this experience, saying it was among the top most meaningful, spiritually significant experiences of my life, and it has changed my life for the better. And the bottom graph is just showing that mystical experience score predicts these ratings a year later, and overall intensity does not. I'll kind of go through this quickly. We did just to help you believe that maybe this isn't just a magical product of Hopkins, 1,600 people in about 2 months responded to a survey I posted, and it was an anonymous survey, and we essentially replicated all of our lab results. And the degree of enthusiasm that people had to respond about profound psilocybin experiences and the reliability of the data suggests that what we're measuring in the lab is actually a real phenomenon out there in the world. And the unity, sacredness, and positive mood seem to predict long-term effects better than some of the other factors. Okay, so personality. Personality is the kind of the thing about you that doesn't really change, that you feel makes you who you are. In psychology, this has been one of the most well-studied constructs over the last 50 years. Cross-culturally, we see that there are certain domains of personality that seem to be the same. So you have neuroticism, which is kind of being tense, anxious, moody, impulsive. Extroversion, self-explanatory. Agreeableness, how well you get along with others and cooperate. Openness, and then I'll talk more about openness, and conscientiousness, if you follow rules and plan and are kind of organized. So those 5 factors are there across your lifetime. You can be high and low in different ones. It's heritable, so about 50% of personality is genetic, and it's relatively stable after age 30. There's a gold standard measure of personality called the Neo-Personality Inventory. There are 240 items that you either agree with or disagree with, and that gets at these 5 factors and the kind of sub-facets of each factor, which get at more specific traits. There's some anecdotal and subjective claims that psilocybin can change personality, but not much objective evidence. So the McLaughlin study back in '67 showed that LSD produced some short-term changes on measures of creativity and artistic ability, but they were basically gone after 6 months. And importantly, we actually didn't have a good way of measuring personality that everyone agreed on when the hallucinogen research was stopped in the late 60s. And now we do, we have the NEO. And you can argue if the NEO is the best, but there's actually a strong consensus around the NEO as being a really good measure of personality now in social psychology. So there's one domain of personality that seems to fit best with the anecdotal claims from psychedelics, which is kind of openness, open-mindedness. I like this quote. You can read it as I talk about the different facets. You can imagine openness as being imaginative, interested in problem solving, abstract ideas, interest in art and music, openness to your own and others' feelings. There's a little bit of a controversial piece where it predicts socially conservative versus liberal tendencies, as well as what kind of actions or behaviors you're likely to engage in. Again, this fits with the subjective claims of hallucinogens in early studies and currently. So a lot of times people will go through these laboratory experiments and then claim certain changes in the long run that seem to fit with the domain of openness. And there's some cross-sectional evidence that hallucinogen users versus other drug users value things like openness in their life, but the cross-sectional thing is a little bit hard to interpret. So So what I decided to do is look at longitudinal change in openness from before to after the session, and then again 14 months later. And I combined across the two studies to get more power to see if there was any real effect. And essentially what you see, it doesn't, it's not that impressive when you look at it this way, but from screening until after psilocybin, 1 to 2 months after the session, after the high dose session, you see a significant increase. And this looks like a tiny effect, but actually openness and the other domains are not supposed to change at all. So there's something going on there that seems to be reliable. Moreover, it seemed that the amount of change in openness was predicted by how strong your mystical experience was on the session day. So you have openness change along the y-axis and mystical experience. So this guy up here, or this lady, they really won the golden ticket in our study. This amount of change in personality is, it's almost unbelievable. And you can see that it's kind of correlated with the strength of the mystical experience. And these folks down here didn't really have a strong mystical experience for whatever reason, and their personality didn't change. Their openness didn't increase. We had some other fancy statistical ways of showing that this wasn't just a correlation, that actually mystical score seemed to predict openness better than some of the other measures we had. And you can also look at it this way. You can split up the people into those who had a complete mystical experience, which is a little bit more than half, and those who didn't. And you can see, if you look at the white circles, the people who didn't are staying really stable. So they look like the population, not changing. And the people who had a complete mystical experience are increasing. More surprisingly to me was that these increases were still there 14 months later. So this I think this really shook up the personality world, because it means that a single session, obviously with a certain clinical approach, a lot of preparation, safe environment, all of that, but a single session with a drug changed personality more than anything else that has been shown really in the whole literature of personality. And it was still there 14 months later. We can talk a little bit about where the people started to begin with. They were already pretty high in openness, but I think that helps the believability of our results, because there's less room for them to go up. I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but the overall impression you should get here is that the increases were there for all of the different facets. So people were increasing on all the different domains of openness. It wasn't just like so fantasy, you can imagine that one would be fairly obvious to increase fantasy imagination. That wasn't just the one driving all of the effects. You can read some of the items to give you an idea. So aesthetics, I'm intrigued by patterns I find in art and nature. I enjoy playing with theories or abstract ideas. You might be getting the sense that everyone here is probably maxing out on openness, so I don't know if psilocybin would really be able to touch that, but. Okay, for future directions, we want to look at what aspects or factors of the mystical experience are most predictive of changes in personality, and we've been doing some kind of boring factor analysis of our questionnaires to kind of get at what might be the best predictive piece of the way we're trying to measure the experience. It might not be mystical experience the way we've been conceptualizing it. There's a lot of really nice work done in recent years on self-transcendence, the benefits of being selfless, mostly from the first citation is Matthieu Ricard, so kind of from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of training, and some other work showing that distance from self can actually increase wisdom and adaptive psychological behaviors. It's possible that the Hopkins group is really good at producing mystical experiences and increases in openness. So in kind of a best case scenario, I'd like to do a full year-long study where some of the people never get a high dose of psilocybin, but we track their personality over a long period of time to see if just interacting with us and exposing them to new ideas can cause the bump. And of course, we'd like to get to objective measures of openness. So what do I mean by objective measures? There was a great, really interesting early study by Jim Fadiman and colleagues at Stanford where they gave low doses of LSD to engineers and scientists who were stuck on an important problem. And they wanted to see if it helped them solve the problem. The problem is that they didn't really have a good outcome measure for what it meant to solve this really intractable problem that was only interesting to a small set of engineers or scientists. Now we have better measures of creativity and problem solving in the laboratory and a better understanding of the neural correlates of creativity. So it seems pretty obvious to me that we could easily take our findings and look at objective measures of problem solving and creativity in the lab. There's another set of research from social psychology looking at qualities like curiosity, being inspired, feeling inspired, predicting things like how many patents people hold. This is all research done in the US. The inspiration work is done by Todd Thrash and colleagues. And these things, these kind of pieces of psychology might be related to openness. And finally, for those of you who are impressed by actual numbers, there was a recent study, an economics study, that showed that one standard deviation increase in openness was equivalent to an increase in $60,000 of annual income. Some of the other personality factors apparently cost more, so if you decrease your neuroticism, it's something like $300,000 annual income. There's some other work showing that intellectual curiosity, which is one of the facets of openness, combined with effort, is as good at predicting academic and work achievement as IQ. So I see psilocybin as potentially not just a therapeutic application, but an application to making kind of the socioeconomic education sphere more fair, that you're giving people a chance to actually gain traits that they weren't born with. There are a bunch of clinical applications. I think Robin's going to talk a little bit more about that. Increases in openness could obviously help in disorders that involve depression, anxiety, rigid thinking, low serotonergic function. So I left out all of the biochemical stuff because Robin's going to take care of that in a really elegant way in just a little bit. But basically, the thing that psilocybin acts on could have therapeutic applications across the board in a lot of psychiatric disorders. Before you get too excited, the other thing that we're all probably a little high in here is some of the magical thinking and, loss of boundaries stuff going on. Increases in openness are not always good. They're correlated with schizotypy, which is you can function pretty well with it, but you can also run into problems in your life, depending on the context you find yourself in. Mania and other kind of negative implications of, do you want to change who you are? And these are kind of open questions. Okay, one more story from our friend who had the mystical experience. We're doing a study now that combines daily meditation with psilocybin sessions in healthy volunteers. And this person had received about a month and a half of meditation instruction before their first session. And he was only meditating maybe about 10 or 15 minutes a day every morning. I was actually the person teaching him the meditation, so I can talk to you more about what kind of instruction I gave, which could really affect how people react to the sessions. But essentially, this is what he said. This was in the same session I read from before, but later on in the day when the effects of psilocybin were kind of starting to wear off. He said, I remembered the instructions about how the mind will come up with all kinds of ways to distract you, to keep you in your body, and once I acknowledged that, I felt myself relaxing a bit. I focused on my breath and pulled in what I had learned from meditation over the last month and a half, and I felt myself going deeper and deeper. I started to feel a pleasing warmth at the base of my spine, and soon it was encompassing my whole body. It was tremendously relaxing and peaceful, pure bliss. I have no idea how long this lasted, as I again found myself outside myself and held in the moment. All time seemed the same. There was no distinction between past, present, and future. It was all now. The way I kind of see what psilocybin can possibly give to meditation and vice versa is I've seen a lot of people struggle through many years of meditation and kind of beat themselves up and they kind of run into all sorts of obstacles. You can argue whether those obstacles are necessary, that you have to learn some kind of discipline, but I think it can be a little bit easier than that. And I think that in the end, no one's really keeping track. There are no shortcuts. And psilocybin, if it can help people learn what it feels like to what I call embodying the present moment, I think that that can only be helpful, again, with the right teacher and a little bit of kind of a reality check once in a while. So I really like this quote from Eric Weiner. He said, that meditation can teach you to pause just long enough to realize that your life is a freaking miracle, and the least you can do is pay attention. And meditation can teach you that over a long period of time, but I think that psilocybin can give people a glimpse into how the present moment feels, the now, and how it can also be very peaceful and accepting. Psilocybin can also pretty quickly bring people into confrontation with their own pain and fear and discomfort in a way that you might learn through meditation over a gradual period of time, but I think it can kind of shake up the experience to show you that your mind is constantly projecting and you can still observe despite all of the chaos. And finally, I've begun to think a little bit more about how psilocybin might be like meditation. At first glance, it doesn't really improve your concentration in any way. It doesn't teach you mindfulness directly, but there are kind of other aspects, and I go to the Theravadan Buddhism tradition because, well, they're really practical, and if the practical folks talk about things like energy, rapture, tranquility, and equanimity, then I think that they're probably trustworthy. And I think that there are some parallels here between what people experience on psilocybin and certain experiences that can come about through very long-term meditation practice. Again, giving people a glimpse into what meditation not necessarily will lead you to, but the things that you might uncover there that are coming from your own mind. I think a possible convergence between psilocybin and meditation also might be this increase in vividness and clarity of perception. And I can talk more about that afterward. It's a little bit, I think I'm the only person really thinking along these lines in terms of really basic perception and how that might relate to openness. I've done quite a bit of work with long-term meditation training and showing changes in visual perception with really boring tasks like these line stimuli you see up here. But I think at some level, these really low-level perceptual changes do impact this really high-level feeling of openness and well-being. And there's some interesting ways that we could kind of look at that scientifically in terms of novelty detection and interpersonal sensitivity, detecting emotions in yourself and others. Okay, I'm already over time, but time doesn't exist, right? So, okay, I'm actually so excited that I got to spend an entire week here before giving this talk because I embarrassingly know nothing about philosophy. I knew very little about a lot of the topics covered here, so I kind of got this really quick introduction. But I was intrigued by this idea of there being a gap between science and biology and material world, the objective side and the subjective consciousness, spirituality, metaphysical side. And it's true that that gap is not going to go away, I don't think, but I do think that we've been missing a really important tool in this whole enterprise for the last 40, 50 years. And I don't want to make any strong claims. I don't want anyone to kind of freak out when I show this, but I do think that this psilocybin molecule and other molecules like it can really form a bridge between microscopic level biology and the fullest conscious experience you could have as a human being. Again, just as an important tool that we've really been missing, that we're not going to make much progress, I don't think, unless we tackle that as one aspect of the science of consciousness. I'm so excited for you guys to see Robin's talk. He is so much about the brain and serotonin and microscopic level, and I'd just like to leave you with a little literary quote from George Saunders. He's talking about the default mode, and I'd like you to think about what your default mode is. He says, there's an ambient mode in which the mind sits idling before there is information. Some minds idle in a kind of dreading crouch, waiting to be offended. Others stand up straight, eyes slightly wide, expecting to be pleasantly surprised. Some minds, imagining the great what is out there, imagine it intends doom for them. Others imagine there is something out there that may be suffering and in need of help. Which is right? Neither, both. So thank you.
So just a question about methodology, because we're going to save the questions for the end. Sue.
Thank Thank you. A question about your randomization of doses. If I've understood it rightly, they always got the doses in either ascending or descending order. So at the very least, in the middle session, they'd know they'd got a middle dose, which seems to me to get rid of the blind, that you claimed it's blind, but it isn't in that respect.
Yeah, so neither the guides nor the volunteers knew it was ascending and descending. So
okay.
Yeah, so that, sorry, I left that part out. So that whole part of the design was also blind to them. The number
Okay,
of
actually, you did kind of say that, and I didn't twig it by saying that all of those aspects they were blinded to. Yeah.
And
okay,
even the
thank
study
you.
that I'm doing now, I have no idea at all what the hypotheses are. I don't even know what range of doses. I know that they are getting psilocybin at some point. That's it.
So who's determining that?
Roland Griffiths and Matt Johnson are the ones who designed the study, and they have very little interaction with the volunteers compared to me and some of the other clinical folks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's have one from Barrett, and then we'll move on. We'll save the rest for the end. We'll have time for...
And I'll be around all afternoon, so will Robin. So we can answer hundreds of questions.
Hi, I'd like to talk a lot. I have a question about the study design. So you didn't mention a placebo, you mentioned an active comparator, the Ritalin.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering whether there was actually a placebo involved or just the active comparator, and also whether in the longitudinal study, whether you were following up on if there was a placebo, if you were following up on those, and if you were following up on the group that was on the active comparator.
Okay, so the short answer is in the first study, there was no straight up placebo. It was only psilocybin and methylphenidate, but they were actually told they could receive up to 17 different drugs, that none of which they had experience with. So in their experience, it could have felt like nothing possibly. They didn't know that they wouldn't get a true placebo. In the second study, there was a true placebo as well as 5 milligrams, which is subthreshold for a lot of folks. And the short-term changes, so 1 or 2 months after the session, were still fully blind and controlled. The problem at the 14-month time point is that at that point, everyone's gotten psilocybin. So you can't really show that the really long-term change isn't due to some kind of expectation, which I would love to replicate in another study where it involves being a little bit patient because people have to wait a whole year before they possibly get anything worthwhile.
Okay, let's hold the rest for general discussion. Thank Dr. Katherine McLean for a great talk. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. He's in the Neuropsychopharmacology unit, Imperial College in London. He studied psychoanalysis at Brunel University and his PhD at Bristol. And since then, he's been working with Dr. David Nutt, and his talk is How Does Psychedelics Affect the Brain to Alter Consciousness? Let's welcome Robin.
Well, thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks everyone for sticking around. It's very exciting to talk to you. So my name's Robin Carhart-Harris. I'm a postdoc in the Neuropsychopharmacology unit at Imperial College London. And I'll start by telling you what we've recently been up to. So this will form the basis of my talk, actually, our psilocybin fMRI work, recently completed and now written up and published. We've also recently completed a psilocybin MEG study, so actually measuring neural activity with a better temporal resolution that we can get with fMRI. And we're also currently doing an fMRI study with MDMA, so if you don't know, that's ecstasy. And future work, we've recently received a grant to look at the efficacy of psilocybin as a treatment for resistant depression. So that's a particularly exciting study that we have to look forward to. And also we're hoping to begin an LSD fMRI study, so that will be the first that imaging study that's ever been carried out with LSD. Okay, so quickly some acknowledgements. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for my boss, Professor David Nutt. He's my mentor and a real inspiration. Also Amanda Fielding, who's been a major initiating partner in the work that we've been doing. And the Beckley Foundation that have provided a lot of our funding. Also the Hefter Research Institute based here in the States, MAPS, and the Neuropsychoanalysis Association. So okay, to get on with the research. So As I said, my focus will be our results with the psilocybin fMRI work that we've been doing. So the first step before shoving anyone in a scanner was to assess tolerability. So we knew that a fMRI scanner could be a particularly anxiogenic, frightening environment for people. So we wanted to model the restrictiveness of a fMRI setting. It's quite a constrained environment to be in. So when we did that, we studied 9 healthy volunteers, 2 of them are females. 3 received a dose of 1.5 milligrams. This was our starting dose, quite a conservative dose. And after dosing 3 individuals, we realized that the effects were quite mild at this dose. So we sought permission to increase to 2 milligrams, and we subsequently gave that to 6 individuals. So this was in a mock MRI scanner. It was essentially just a wooden tube, but it did the job. We also simulated the quite uncomfortable sound of an fMRI scanner, and it was well tolerated in all individuals. We monitored physiology in real time and also their subjective state. That was something that we couldn't do in the scanner because we were looking at resting state dynamics, and in order to properly study the resting state, you need people to be resting. You can't be asking them how they are every other minute. So this pilot work was quite important. We could map the pharmacodynamics of psilocybin, intravenous psilocybin. And you can see at time 0, which is the end of the infusion, it was a 60-second infusion, 2 milligrams in the case of the higher dose, in 10 mils of saline. By the end of the infusion, they're already starting to feel subjective effects. So this is markedly different to when psychedelics are taken orally. It's very rapid onset, more similar perhaps to smoking DMT. That's one of the comments that some of our volunteers made. And it's relatively intense. So at peak effects, they were rating it at 7 out of 10 for intensity, with 10 being extremely intense. So this is one of our volunteers from that study described it. All of our volunteers were psychedelic experienced, and this volunteer said that that was undoubtedly the most intense psychedelic experience I've ever experienced. So it certainly wasn't a walk in the park, and people were having quite profound experiences with this dose and with this mode of administration. So more broadly, what were people experiencing? So we had our volunteers rate a number of different items, and what I'm presenting here is the top 10 highest rated items. And so the first one, I saw my surroundings change in unusual ways. I saw geometric patterns, that's very classic, associated with classic psychedelics. I felt unusual bodily sensations. This somatic aspect was very prevalent. Things looked strange, quite simply. My imagination was extremely vivid. My sense of time or space, my sense of size or space was altered. This kind of Alice in Wonderland effect that things can seem smaller but also expansive. Sounds influenced things I saw, this kind of synesthesia-esque effects. My thoughts wandered freely, so this sort of itinerancy in our cognition, this going from place to place. My sense of time was altered, so again, very classic with psychedelic drugs. And the experience had a dreamlike quality. That often comes up, that people compare it to the dreamlike state. And actually there is some biological evidence to suggest that the neurophysiology of REM sleep shares some similarities with that of the psychedelic state. So on to the good stuff. So here's our imaging results. We used arterial spin labeling. Here's the design of the arterial spin labeling study. 15 healthy volunteers, all had previous experience with hallucinogens, mean age of 34. It was an 18 minutes resting state scan, and there was 2. So they had placebo, and then they had psilocybin afterwards. It was eyes open, task-free rest, so they had a simple fixation cross, which they looked at. And 2 milligrams psilocybin was infused 8 minutes into the scan. 6 minutes into the scan. Okay, so the key contrast is perfusion or brain blood flow post-infusion versus pre. There were some ratings intermittently every 6 minutes in the scanner. They rated the intensity, and also there was more comprehensive ratings given at the end of the scan. Now here's the good stuff. So These are the decreases that we found in the brain. We didn't find any increases, so this was a major surprise for us. Nowhere in the brain did we find any increases in brain blood flow as a correlate to brain activity. So this was surprising, and people often describe their experiences with psychedelics as being somehow greater than consciousness. People talk about these drugs as being mind-expanding, but we haven't found here, at least in terms of quantitative blood flow, anything that would support that. But it may suggest that we need to think slightly differently about the phenomenology. So we found these decreases in important connector hubs in the brain, so in the thalamus, the posterior cingulate. I should really use the pointer so that you can see the thalamus there in the middle of the brain, posterior cingulate cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex. And also these lateral parietal regions, we saw it in the putamen. So what's interesting about the location of these effects is that these regions serve as important integrating hubs in the brain. So they receive profuse connections, and they also send out diffuse projections from these regions. So decreased activity predicted the intensity of the subjective effects. So again, adding a kind of compelling factor to the significance of these decreases that we were seeing. So the greater the decreases here in the anterior cingulate cortex, the more intense were the subjective effects. Also at a trend level in the thalamus and the posterior cingulate at a trend level. And so here's some very brief reports to give you a better feel for the phenomenology. So one of our volunteers here said that there was a definite sense of lubrication, of freedom, of the cogs being loosened and firing off in all sorts of unexpected directions. So this can help us understand a map between the brain effects and the phenomenology, in the sense that we're seeing drops in activity in these connector hubs, and people are describing a loosening, a freeing of cognition. So this makes sense. Also, time became another meaningless concept. I could have been there a minute or a million years. So this appeals to the very classic altered time perception that you see with psychedelics. And in a moment, I'll offer an explanation, biological explanation for what might be accounting for that. Again, that was real ego death stuff, a total dissolving of the ego boundaries. I only existed as a concept, as an idea. So this, again, is very typical, especially with especially profound psychedelic drug experiences, that people describe this ego disintegration or ego dissolution, this loss of self, and observing the self more objectively rather than being a subject. It was certainly quite difficult at times to know where I ended and where I melted into everything around me. So this is appealing to ego boundaries or subject-object differentiation, which seems to be lost under psychedelics. And again, I'll go on to offer a hypothesis about what might be happening in the brain to account for this. So our results with ASL, measuring brain blood flow, were quite surprising. So we repeated our experiments with a slightly different fMRI modality, BOLD. Again, 15 healthy volunteers were scanned, and the same dose as well. It was well tolerated, and it produced quite strong subjective effects. So we were on good grounds, really, to continue with this dose. Placebo-controlled design. There were 2 scans in this case. We balanced order. So half of the people received psilocybin in their first scan, half the people received placebo in their first scan. In this case, it was eyes closed rest, so they just simply kept their eyes closed and relaxed. And here's the design. And again, the key thing is the key contrast is perfusion, not perfusion, brain activity measured with a BOLD signal, post-infusion of the drug versus pre. And this is where we found the changes. And again, we only found deactivation, so we found no increases anywhere in the brain. And they were localized to similar regions that we saw with ASL. So you can see the ventral posterior cingulate or retrosplenial cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, again a bit of the putamen and insula. With BOLD, we actually saw decreases in this ventral visual stream. That was something that we didn't detect with the ASL. And it's quite interesting. It's curious as to why we found that with BOLD and not ASL. So here I've registered the decreases in bold over the decreases in brain blood flow to show the consistent decreases that we found. And again, just to reiterate, we didn't find any increases in any regions of the brain, only these decreases. And just to show that they were localized, consistent decreases in the ventral posterior cingulate, the medial prefrontal cortex again, and bilaterally in the thalamus here, and the putamen, at least unilaterally. But what does this mean? I've already offered an explanation, and just to reiterate, and quoting this individual again, that there was a definite sense of lubrication, of freedom, of the cogs being loosened and firing off in all sorts of unexpected directions. Okay, so far I've just offered results that are sheer changes up or down in brain activity. So I will go on to some more dynamic measures that we have, which measure essentially connectivity or synchrony between spatially remote regions in the brain and how the activity is coherent in these remote regions of the brain and how that connectivity can change after psilocybin. So again, to talk some more about these hubs and provide some evidence that supports them being hubs, this analysis here has essentially used the time series from the posterior cingulate region and running an independent component analysis which finds spatiotemporally coherent networks in the brain. It does this in a kind of automatic way. Using just a time series from the posterior cingulate, you were able to find the full spectrum of major resting state networks in the brain. So as if the organization of the brain was sort of echoed or represented in this very, well, not necessarily so small, but this independent hub region in the posterior cingulate cortex. So again, supporting that it's an important integrating hub, that a number of different networks which are spatially spread out in the brain can all come together within this local space, and that will serve an integrating function. So we often think about the posterior cingulate as being a key node of the default mode network, but in fact, a lot of these resting state networks can be found within the posterior cingulate. And some diffusion tensor imaging, which is tracking the white matter tracks in the brain. This found that there was the strongest connections in these default mode regions, the posterior cingulate, lateral parietal regions, and also the medial prefrontal cortex here. So again, supporting, this time with a structural measure, the hub nature of these regions that we saw decreases in with psilocybin, decreases in activity. Okay, so it's important to say a little bit more about the default mode network so that you understand it functionally, and it allows you to understand our results in a deeper context. So the default mode networks, you've probably heard about this a lot at the conference. It's especially interesting because, and it was first identified, because a whole swathe of cognitive tasks all consistently deactivated certain regions in the brain. And so regardless of the task, so long as it involves some active cognition, some engaged attention, they would find deactivations in these regions of the brain. Now that was interesting because at baseline, these were the most active regions. They had the highest metabolism and the highest blood flow. So what's going on there when these regions which account for so much of the brain's metabolism and activity are dropping out when we engage in something, some kind of active cognition? So it's suggesting that what's it doing during the resting state? What's it accounting for? And these kind of thoughts have sort of motivated alongside the empirical work that there may be something related to something quite fundamental, perhaps related to the consciousness or our sense of self. I'll go on to provide some empirical support for that. So the default mode regions have undergone significant evolutionary expansion. The default mode network activates during high-level human functions. So some examples: predicting the future, something that we do that perhaps more than other species, that's debatable. Certainly that dexterity in temporal mental time travel, that we can look far into our past and also predict far into the future. Making social and moral judgments, these activate the default mode regions, and contemplating one's past. So these kind of findings, and also that the default mode network is reliably activated when we self-reference or make judgments about ourselves, have led to hypotheses that this network is related to the sense of self. And also, if you subscribe to the Freudian framework, that they may be related to the ego. And another important aspect of the default mode network is its competitive relationship with a task-positive network, said in a very general sense, or an attention network, a network which engages when we engage in active attention or focused cognition. So you can see that network in blue here. This is the task-positive network. And what's interesting, this is just during spontaneous activity recorded during resting state, so there isn't a task driving this kind of antiphase relationship between the networks. This seems to be present during task-free conditions. So it's suggesting that it's a fundamental property of brain function. So as activity in the task-positive network drops, you see a reciprocal increase in the default mode regions. Also, this chart's useful in displaying, in showing you what functional connectivity is, because here we have in yellow the posterior cingulate time series. This is just the activity levels in these regions fluctuating in time. You can see that in yellow the posterior cingulate, and in orange there the medial prefrontal cortex, and their activity is synchronous. So that's telling us that these are regions of the same network. They're part of a coherent network. And that, again, helps us understand how they have a kind of competitive, some say anti-correlated or anti-phase relationship with this task-positive network, and they subserve very different functions. So the default mode is concerned with sort of constrained introspection, like I said, predicting the future, looking into our past, looking inside, really. And the task-positive or attention network is concerned with engaging in the outside world. So it's interesting that this dynamic is reflected in the brain dynamics. And it seems to be a very, very important property of global brain function. The default mode network and personalities. So this is a relatively recent study showing that posterior cingulate connectivity with these default mode regions, when it's higher in individuals where this connectivity is stronger, they score higher on trait neuroticism. And consistently, another default mode region, this ventral medial prefrontal subgenual cingulate cortex region, connectivity with this broader medial prefrontal node of the default mode network. The lower the connectivity between these regions, the higher the agreeableness. So that's consistent. And also here, the same node, this subgenual cingulate region in blue, connectivity with the medial prefrontal cortex node of the default mode network. The lower the connectivity there, the higher the extroversion. So hopefully you can see a consistent picture here that higher default mode connectivity, the more introspective, the more neurotic. Also, there's a relationship here between rumination scores and the strength of this connectivity. So again, supporting this story, the stronger the connectivity within the default mode network, the more ruminative, the more introspective, the more neurotic, the more depressed. So these are effects on global brain function. So this is taking us back a little bit, but it's important to give this talk and not skip over the pharmacology. So very, very quickly, there's a Liberty Cap magic mushroom. Psilocybin is the active component of that, but more truly, actually, it's the prodrug of psilocin. So when psilocybin gets into the body, it's quickly dephosphorylated to psilocin, and that's the active compound which binds to serotonin receptors, and I'll tell you which ones are particularly important. And then downstream of that are the brain activity changes that I've talked about. And it's just interesting to see the similarity here between this active compound and the endogenous neurotransmitter serotonin, or 5-HT. Very, very similar in structure, subtly different in pharmacology, and we know they have very different effects on brain function. So where does it all start? Well, actually, it seems to start, there's good evidence that it starts at the serotonin 2A receptor, and so the evidence that supports that is that the higher the affinity of a hallucinogenic drug for the serotonin 2A receptor, the higher its potency in man. Mescaline's down here. LSD is of particularly high affinity, particular high affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor, so it's especially sticky. That's what affinity is. This compound really sticks at the serotonin 2A receptor. So it's very sticky LSD, and it's also very potent. Mescaline, on the other hand, is less sticky, and so it's less potent. You need to take more of it to get the effects. Psilocybin's not actually on this chart, or psilocin, but if it was, it would be roughly around here, 2 orders of magnitude less potent than LSD. More evidence which supports the role of the serotonin 2A receptor in the mechanism of action of psychedelics. If you block the serotonin 2A receptor with an antagonist, ketanserin, then it will block the hallucinogenic effects in humans. So that's good evidence that this receptor is where it all starts. So just very briefly, where is the serotonin 2A receptor? Well, it's concentrated in the cortex. Interestingly, it's expressed most highly in the posterior cingulate cortex. This is PET data in humans, very large sample, so it's reliable data. On a more reduced level, it's especially densely expressed in layer 5 pyramidal cells. You could argue whether you need this level of detail, but it's important to have, I think, at least as reference. But it's also expressed on interneurons in the brain. And so these are inhibitory cells which shut off the excitatory cells, which are the pyramidals. So in terms of our deactivations, rather, and what accounts for them, it could either be a direct effect of psilocin stimulating 2A receptors on the inhibitory interneurons and shutting off pyramidal cell activity, or it could be indirect by activating pyramidal cells which project onto interneurons, which then have their inhibitory action. So some animal work might be able to tease that out. We know in animals, actually, that certain hallucinogenic drugs do actually decrease neural activity in the brain, so there is support for our human data here. So functionally, what is the serotonin 2A receptor linked to? So this helps us with the depression story, because deficient serotonin 2A stimulation is linked to trait pessimism. So the higher the expression of the serotonin 2A receptor in the cortex, suggesting low synaptic 5-HT, and so low stimulation of those receptors, they'll upregulate if they're not getting stimulated, then the higher the trait pessimism, or neuroticism in this case. This is in healthy individuals, but just personality measures. So the higher the neuroticism, the higher the 2A binding. So the more the 2A. Also here in depressed patients, this is a correlation between 2A binding, so 2A expression, the higher the 2A, because of deficient low levels of synaptic serotonin, so low stimulation of these receptors, and again, higher trait pessimism in these individuals. And our old friend, the medial prefrontal cortex, the relationship was especially strong in the medial prefrontal cortex, which we know is hyperactive in depression and deactivated by a number of effective treatments for depression. So back to global brain function and onto our functional connectivity results. So I've already given you a sense of what functional connectivity is. It's essentially synchronous, temporally synchronous activity in spatially sometimes remote brain regions. And so what do we analyze? Well, we looked at connectivity with the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is a major node of the default mode network, and it's also a region that we saw consistent deactivations in with psilocybin, with our BOLD and ASL analyses. So we chose this as a region of interest to perform a functional connectivity analysis on our data. And so this is in the placebo scans in our 15 individuals. And this map here shows regions in the brain where activity is synchronous with this seed region. So the seed region is the medial prefrontal cortex, and the rest of the yellow and the orange are essentially regions where the activity was synchronous. It fluctuated together. So what was the effect of psilocybin on this network? We know this network should look familiar to you. It's the default mode network, all the hubs of it. So the effect of psilocybin on this network was to disintegrate it, essentially. So a major major hub of the default mode network, which is usually closely synchronous in activity with the medial prefrontal cortex, became desynchronous. It became disconnected. So there was a literal decoupling or disconnect or disintegration in this default mode network linked to the sense of self. And that was interesting. We repeated the analysis with the hippocampus, the major subcortical node of the default mode network. This is the map which shows regions in the brain where activity is synchronous with our seed region here, the hippocampus and the parahippocampal gyrus. You can see the major nodes of the default mode network: medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex. Here's the extended medial temporal regions and the mediodorsal thalamus. So what was the effect of psilocybin on this network? Well, this was even more dramatic. We found every node of the default mode network became decoupled from this major subcortical node of the default mode network. So the posterior cingulate, there was massive effects, huge decoupling there, and the medial prefrontal cortex and also these lateral parietal nodes of the default mode network. So a real literal disintegration of this network associated with the sense of self. In terms of regions where activity was increased, we saw this frontoinsular region become significantly more connected with the medial temporal region. So the insula is associated with kind of visceral sensations, emotion. It's interesting that this sort of limbic memory region, the hippocampus, became more coupled with a region closely associated with sort of visceral sensations. So maybe a kind of regression of the system down to a more kind of lower level, sort of primitive emotion, memory, decoupled from the high level cortical regions, which would exert a constraining influence on the limbic system ordinarily. And this might account for why the drug might be useful in psychotherapy. The classic rationale for the use of psychedelics in psychotherapy was that it reduced psychological defenses, it lowered the ego, and this allowed unconscious material, if you want, in a Freudian context, or salient emotions and memories to come up to the surface so that they could then be talked through and people could learn something about themselves. They could have some insight about perhaps personal conflicts or things that they've been avoiding, perhaps. Okay, so to move on, an explanation for altered time perception. So you see here a disconnect between the medial temporal regions and the default mode network. Well, what does the usual connect between these regions mean? What does it do? Well, there seems to be a relationship between medial temporal to default mode connectivity and the frequency of our sort of temporally expansive thinking. So the more we think about ourselves in the past, or the more we think about the future, the stronger the connectivity between the medial temporal regions and these higher level default mode regions, posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is interesting, and it may account for the kind of consistent narrative that we usually have in normal waking consciousness, that we have a kind of coherence to our story, to our narrative self, to who we are and where we are and what we've experienced and what we might experience in the future. So is this evidence for ego disintegration, that we see silencing is too strong a word, but we see a decrease in activity in these hub structures or the default mode network, and also including the thalamus here. And we also see this interesting disconnect between the nodes of the default mode network after psilocybin. So just to reiterate that this default mode network and its connectivity and its activity seems to be related strongly to the sense of self. So again, just to quote one of our subjects, he said that this was real ego death stuff. A total dissolving of the ego boundaries only existed as a concept or as an idea. So in this way, he's sort of viewing himself objectively, less as being sort of in himself as a subject. So these effects are consistent with meditation we've recently found, and this may map onto the phenomenology of the two experiences, that they are similar, as Katherine described. So 3 studies have found decreased activity in the medial prefrontal cortex node of the default mode network with meditation, and we found this with psilocybin. Also, a number of effective treatments for depression, as I suggested earlier, seem to suppress medial prefrontal activity. So SSRIs, CBT, psychotherapy, sleep deprivation, effective treatment for depression, ECT, highly effective but controversial treatment for depression, placebo even decreases activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, and also deep brain stimulation, so actual targeting of the the brain matter itself and shutting it off with electrical stimulation. So these all decrease activity in this region, and there is evidence for efficacy in depression. Also ketamine. Decrease between network competitions. So this is another thing that we analyzed with psilocybin. So I've already described how the default mode network and the task-positive network usually have this kind of competitive, anti-phase, anti-correlated relationship. They're subserving very different functions. You could say competitive functions. You can only ever daydream or engage in something. You can't really do both, perhaps unless you're on psychedelics or meditating. So that's a hint to what I'm going to talk about in a moment. So with nicotine, which sharpens cognition, in this case, these were smokers in withdrawal. You can see under nicotine replacement therapy on the left here, there's a very sharp anti-correlation. So there's a sharpening of the competitive relationship between the networks. And the strength of this anti-correlation and the sharpening of it correlated with improved cognition. And under placebo, they were a bit muddled, and so their networks are less competitive. They're less orthogonal. So decreased default mode network, task-positive network competition has been found in schizophrenia. Interestingly, also in early psychosis, where the phenomenology may be more similar to what we see in the psychedelic state, and perhaps, arguably, with some very deep meditation. So in early psychosis, you typically see things like disturbed sense of self, disturbed ego boundaries. So early psychosis would be referring to pre-delusional, and just really when phenomenologically, the kind of experiences where the world becomes strange and people they're not sure what's going on. And the phenomenology in this stage may be more similar to the psychedelic state. Deep meditation, they found this decrease in the competition or anti-correlation between the default mode and task-positive network. Also in a particular kind of meditation, non-dual awareness, which appeals to the loss of subject-object boundaries or ego boundaries. So it's suggesting that if you have the default mode network subserving the subject or the self, task-positive network subserving the object or engaging in the world, then it makes sense that competition between these two networks, as that decreases, you get phenomenology which appeals to the dissolution of ego boundaries or the loss of subject-object differentiation. So a hypothesis here is what I just said, that default mode network versus task-positive competition underlies subject-object differentiation or ego boundaries. And this is consistent with what people were reporting in their psychedelic experiences with psilocybin. So one volunteer, just to repeat what I've said before, it was certainly quite difficult at times to know where I ended and where I melted into everything around me. So it's very hard to describe what this dissolution of ego boundaries is, but quotes like that can really help us. Changes in functional connectivity. Okay, so this is the default mode network versus task-positive connectivity measure, which we did under psilocybin. In blue, you can see the dorsal attention system, which is a classic task-positive network. It engages when we typically engage in physiospatial attention, and the default mode network in orange here. So you can see post-placebo, it's very faint, but there's actually a sort of negative correlation between the activity. So as activity in one network goes up, activity in the other goes down. And this is during resting state, so there isn't a task driving this sort of inverse correlation or inverse relationship. It's something which is fundamentally there in the global brain dynamics. And then we find under psilocybin, there was a significant increase in the connectivity or a decrease in the competition between the two networks. So we found that with the dorsal attention system and the default mode network. We also found it with what's referred to as the Salient System, which is another classic task-positive network. Engages when we focus our attention, and it has this anti-phase or orthogonal relationship with the default mode network. You can see post-placebo, there is no connectivity between the two networks. Then under psilocybin, there's a significant increase in connectivity or a decrease in competition between the two networks. And it's quite nice to actually see the time series. So here we've got blown up the time series of the salience network versus the default mode network. You can see on the left, lost my cursor, that there is orthogonality, they're essentially different networks, yet under psilocybin there's quite a dramatic change and they become almost as if they're the same network, which is very strange. I mean, these networks subserve very, very different functions, and here under psilocybin they're operating as if they're the same network. So decreased default mode network, TUS-positive network connectivity has also been found in sedation, which doesn't perhaps fit the story that I'm telling here, that somehow decreased competition between these networks accounts for subject-object, a dissolution of subject-object boundaries. So under sedation, there's a graded, so the decrease in anti-correlation, or the more correlated the default mode network and the TUS-positive network, the more unconscious the individual. So at waking it's present, then at mild sedation it's slightly less, and then at unconsciousness there isn't any anti-correlation essentially. So this is slightly inconsistent rather, well, the findings here are consistent, I mean, in terms of the changes in default mode versus TUS-positive network connectivity, but the phenomenology is very different. So none of our subjects reported reduced consciousness, they didn't report sedation, but the findings in terms of resting state network connectivity were the same. So what's going on there and what accounts for that? So one thing that has been found with sedation is decreased thalamocortical connectivity. And this was found here with the default mode network, the top one there, and the thalamus. And again, this graded decrease in thalamocortical connectivity. So it's present in waking, reduced in mild sedation, and further reduced in unconsciousness. And this was true for the default mode network and thalamus connectivity, and also for the TUS-positive network and thalamus connectivity. Very neat correlation there between the level of consciousness and thalamocortical connectivity. So this raised the question, what do we see with psilocybin? Do we see the same loss in thalamocortical connectivity? And if we don't, then could that account for the difference in the phenomenology? So we measured this. So here's the thalamus in orange and the default mode network in blue, and we measured the connectivity between the two. I think my gray on this chart is very faint, it's at this level. And here's post-psilocybin, so here's post-placebo. And again, we've got pre-psilocybin and post-psilocybin. They're just two different contrasts, but essentially measuring the same thing. So we found no significant change, and if anything, there was a slight trend increase in thalamocortical connectivity with psilocybin. So that's inconsistent with what's been found in sedation, and then this might account for the difference in the phenomenology. So again, this time looking at TUS-positive network connectivity. This time we actually saw a significant increase in connectivity between the thalamus and the TUS-positive network after psilocybin. So this is inconsistent with what's been found in sedation. So it raises the idea, here we have preserved or increased thalamocortical coupling. This is inconsistent or even opposite to what's been found in sedation. So some summary hypotheses to end my talk. Default mode activity and connectivity this is a hypothesis that can be tested. It seems to not specifically be related to consciousness, but rather a facet of consciousness or an aspect of consciousness, and a very important one, perhaps more a facet of mind, really. And that's constrained introspection or agency, or rather, if you prefer the term, narrative self. It's who we are. And if you have this narrative self, you should have preserved default mode activity and default mode connectivity. So that's the hypothesis that I'm submitting. And you've heard this enough times, so I won't say it again. But to move on to the second hypothesis, default mode versus TUS-positive network competition is related to subject-object differentiation, that we feel that we're an agent separate from the world, something which we do experience during normal waking consciousness, and perhaps is reduced during meditation, and perhaps with psychedelic drugs, and perhaps in early psychosis. Now this subject-object differentiation is otherwise referred to as ego boundaries, and that disturbed default mode network, TUS-positive network competition in the presence, and this is key, in the presence of preserved thalamocortical connectivity is related to disturbed ego boundaries. So that's the hypothesis that I'll end on. Here's a slightly elaborate metaphor for how psychedelics may work in the brain, that here we have on the left a man blowing smoke into a bubble, and a system forms with constraints, which is the outside of the bubble, and here we have an organized system. Then if he blows on the bubble, it bursts and the dynamics can move more freely. They're no longer constrained. So it's slightly loose, and perhaps some people might like it. People like metaphors, but so that's a metaphor for how these changes in brain dynamics that we're seeing with our imaging may account for the sort of loosening of cognition that we see with psychedelics in terms of the phenomenology. And just to end with a happy story, people like happy stories, and which leads on to our future work in depression. This is one of our volunteers. It may seem that we're only presenting the happy stories here, but consistently we've seen people reporting positive mood changes, as Katherine has with her psilocybin work. It seems critical that you mediate the psychedelic experience with appropriate care, and when you do this, you do seem to consistently see positive mood effects. It would be a different matter if we were doing something to perhaps scare our volunteers while they're in this state. Maybe then we might see negative mood effects. It's a very supple state. And so this suppleness seems to support how we can get in there, mediate where they are, and perhaps have some therapeutic benefit. But just to read this to you, ever since Thursday, I'd say I found it much easier to engage in the moment, to attend to the here and now, whether this be watching water in a fountain or sitting in science talks and meetings this morning. There were some fountains in Cardiff, and the water was being blown by the wind. The scanning we were doing was in Cardiff, and this was after her experience. And this was allowing the sun to highlight the spray. I could have watched it for ages. Somehow the beauty was enhanced. Whatever it was, it has lasted, like the sun shining through the leaves this morning. It made me slow down my walk to work and enjoy the experience of it flickering over my face. So just to end, thanks for your attention, and if you have any questions, that'd be great.
Thanks so much. That's really awesome. We're going to have a bunch of questions. I'm going to take the prerogative for the first question, as you might guess. So we have a fundamental paradox here. These people have enhanced consciousness. You could say they're tripping their brains out. And yet the metabolism, the blood flow, is reduced.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned the other day, in my view, there's a fractal of consciousness with layers, a hierarchy, and consciousness can move up and down. And as you go down, you get more intense. And as you go down and go inside neurons to, say, the quantum level, you would have more enhanced activity, and yet you wouldn't need the membrane. So is that consistent or inconsistent with what you...
Actually, I would say there is some consistency there. So, I mean, we know that the brain is organized hierarchically. You can certainly see that when you look at the organization of the visual system. And what you see with psychedelics is that certain sort of aspects of the hierarchy perhaps become sort of manifest in the state. So, for instance, people see hallucinated motion, they see geometric patterns. There's sort of layers of the visual hierarchy which account for these different things. So it suggests that if you have a disturbance of the hierarchical organization, then these layers can sort of function more autonomously. And so you can see perhaps even the functional organization of the visual cortex. You can see its geometric organization, or you can see regions that account for movement, for motion.
Okay, Bill Faw over there.
Quick comment and then question. The comment is, I noticed on CNN last night, they're reporting on a study or experimental thing where they have implanted electrodes into medial prefrontal, they specifically labeled area 25.
Yeah.
And people with very, very, very resistant depression coming out of it fairly quickly from this. They worked out a power pack type of thing so that they would get this stimulation in 25. That's just a comment that I think is very consistent with that area being crucial in terms of depression. The question then is, where the default and the TPN thing are decoupled, where the competition is decoupled, the locus ceruleus in the pons is often stated as a possible toggle area between these two. At least I've heard that reported on here at the last Tucson and so on. And of course, locus ceruleus is basically norepinephrine center and so on. But I'm wondering if that's the area where the competition between these two networks occurs and is perhaps decoupled by psilocybin. I don't know what that'd have to do with serotonin, except serotonin raphe areas do feed into the locus coeruleus. Is this involved at all that you know?
Well, there's some evidence that catecholamine centers in the brainstem, so dopamine centers. I don't know about the locus coeruleus actually, but they have connectivity with, certainly we know anatomically they have connectivity with the Salient System, so there's dense dopaminergic projections to the insula and to the dorsal anterior cingulate. It sort of supports, if you want to think about the LC and what that might be connected to, you might suggest the TUS positive network and particularly the salience network. And there's some sort of very loose speculation that the dorsal raphe, the serotonergic cell bodies, they may have some connectivity with the default mode. Maybe something there.
Before we get to the next question, could somebody else run this other mic and we can cover both sides of the room? That'd be very helpful because we have, thanks, Graham. Barrett.
Yeah, so somewhat related. I would like to know a little bit more about the other neurotransmitters that might be involved in this. The psychedelics do not bind selectively to 5-HT2A, so I'm wondering whether you did any serum analysis or whether you could say any more about or norepinephrine, dopamine, or were there any of the other neurotransmitters that are normally involved in some of the antidepressant and anti-seizure drugs that were effective?
Well, I mean, you could go into great depth about the pharmacology, so I just presented the basis, really, and it's nice to have coherent stories in the serotonin 2A. The importance of that does seem to be critical. LSDs are more non-selective compounds, so that binds to a number of different receptors. That may account for some of its added potency, may not just be its affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor. Certainly there are other receptors involved in these drugs' mechanisms of action.
Hi, Robin. Thank you. I wanted to ask about your study design and your upcoming psilocybin depression study. I was wondering what's the design? Is it a purely pharmacological intervention, or is it going to be more like some of the other research being done where it's psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy? I would expect that because it's IV in the short time course that really restricts a sort of psychedelic psychotherapy possibilities.
Well, it's a very good question, something we've thought a lot about. We actually went to visit the Hopkins team to get their advice on how we should mediate the experience that we give our volunteers with depression. And so there's some thinking that there may be some sort of native antidepressant action of the drug, that it doesn't require mediation, but I don't really subscribe to that. I think mediation is critical, and there'll certainly be the right level of care, preparation and aftercare to the experience. Well, I think the sort of style of therapy will be relatively passive, will allow the experience to play out as it does, and then whatever insights, we'll try and mediate it in the right way. But I think it's important to let whatever comes up, come up, to allow that to happen, and for the patients to know that it's okay if bad stuff comes up, that this can be worked through, and perhaps that bad stuff coming up could be the most therapeutic potentially.
So, question relating the difference between sedation and then your data, right?
Yeah.
So, the common point is that there is some decreased default network connectivity in the two data set. In anesthesia, there is not only decreased connectivity in the default network, but also in the TAS-positive network and actually in all associative networks of the brain.
Yeah.
Not in visual or auditory, but there is decreased cortical-cortical and thalamocortical connectivity.
Yeah.
Not only in the default network, but somewhere else.
Yeah.
So did you look at TAS-positive, like cortical-cortical connectivity in your data? Because that could explain why consciousness doesn't disappear, but more like the self-related content.
Yeah.
And then you still have something.
That's a really good question.
And then also, like maybe you were talking about the visualness of the subject experience. Maybe another way to look more directly at that would be also to look in the visual network per se.
Yes.
I don't know, but I don't know if you looked at that.
Well,
because kind of, for me, thalamocortical connectivity per se is maybe not specific enough to explain the difference in content.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So I would go in special dose network and look at that.
Well, I
But
think
don't
you're
know.
right. In order to make the claim that I have, we need to do those analyses, and that's really got a number of things to do over the next few months, but that's one of them. We definitely need to look at the TUS-positive frontoparietal networks, because I don't know if you'd argue this actually, in the consciousness research, maybe they are the better markers of reduced consciousness. Melanie, what do you think?
I think both are.
Both are.
And when we look at very heavy stage or in anesthesia, I mean, they're both impaired equally.
Yeah.
But you need both to be impaired.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of how we think.
So
If both are down, then you're knockout. But
Right,
if one
right.
of them works, then
Well,
you're knockout.
I mean, it's a really interesting question, because if we now go and test a TUS-positive network connectivity and we see decreases there, I mean, then we have the specificity for the thalamus. But if we don't, then we don't have that specificity, and that weakens the hypothesis that I gave you.
Yeah, well, at least you can look if there's a difference in that. But I would expect, I don't know, like my guess would be you would have some plus of connectivity.
Yeah.
Also because you see that like plus of thalamocortical connectivity, like even increase. So I don't know.
Posterior cingulate is the next place to look, and then after that, definitely the TUS-positives.
Thank you.
Let me just say, we're asking for questions for both speakers, so you might have a question for Katherine, too. Alexander.
So, sir, in the chart regarding the reactions, there was a point, I'm here, the sounds change the way of view. Was eventually, in this regard, do you have some details, kind of what type of sounds, what changes?
Is that so? In terms of,
to hear if not here.
so, well, the auditory perception, it subtly changes. The sensory modality which has the most change, well, it's a toss-up between the visual and proprioceptive, actually. So the body feels very strange bodily sensations, and also just the sense of body and space is very altered. But visual as well. So your question was about the auditory perception. There's the fMRI scanner noise is very noisy. It's a bit abrasive, kind of repetitive sound. It's not very nice. People said that maybe slightly changed in its pace, maybe a slight slowing. But the auditory modality wasn't the major one that they focused on as being different. Sometimes actually the sound sort of morphed into some strange sort of fantasy in their head that there was some maybe gremlin generating these sounds.
It's very interesting. Speech is also sound. I mean, there is a difference. Noise is also sound. There is a difference between speech or
I could maybe jump in here because what I left out is we actually have participants with eye shades and headphones on for most of the sessions. So their dominant input is auditory, and it's classical music and some Indian music. It's a standard soundtrack that we've used for many, many years. We found that it actually really works. It works better than people having a choice over the music, and it works a lot better than having them have to interact with us. It depends a little bit, I think, on what kind of preparation you give people about what to do with the auditory input. And we use the music mostly as kind of a safety net in case they start to get a little bit too far out or in a cognitive loop about something that they can't really resolve, or they get kind of too distracted by stuff going on in their body. We'll always remind them that they have the music and they can just kind of let the music carry them. I mentioned earlier set and setting was one of Tim Leary's legacies. I think the other one is when in doubt, float downstream. And so that's kind of the music for us, is just letting them float downstream until they seem like they kind of have a better handle on what's unfolding. So the auditory thing can change depending on the instructions about what to do with it.
In the back.
Okay, yes, Katherine, I think this is a comment more for you, but I received, my mentor was Duncan Blewett, who did some of those early researches with LSD in Canada back in the 50s. And your comment about it being called the psychotomimetic brought to mind his comment that he said, I took LSD to find out what it was like to be crazy. Instead, I found out what it was like to be sane. So that's for you. And also, because there are so many people who cheered the finding of the psilocybin under your chairs, if you haven't supported MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or are unaware of it, it is a wonderful organization, and it is doing much research, as Robin has gotten support from them, and I would just recommend it to look at their website, if nothing else.
Thank you for that comment. I do think the really interesting thing about psychedelics to me is that you can have the exact same drug be one of the worst experiences of your life or the best. And I think context really matters. At Hopkins, for obvious reasons, we don't promote any use outside of a kind of controlled medical therapeutic context, although I'm very excited that groups like MAPS and others are continuing to do the really good hard work of trying to get some of the laws changed around psychedelics. The thing about psychotomimetic is sometimes I remind myself of this in sessions that any experience that is kind of time limited and you're reminded that you're going to come back to normal consensus reality, I think there's a lot of to be gained there. But when it becomes psychotomimetic, I think is when people feel like it might actually just keep going that way for a long period of time. And sometimes I even remind my volunteers that the most blissful state, if you found out you were stuck there for eternity, might not actually be where you want to be. So that may be where it's a matter of the transience of it and the fact that most people do want to return to some kind of normal basis.
My question is to both of you. I was wondering about possible effects, if any, of selection bias. So, Katherine, you mentioned that all of your subjects were spiritually inclined, and Robin, you mentioned that all your subjects had been previous users. And from a personal perspective, now that I'm quite curious to try it myself, I do not consider myself particularly spiritually inclined, and I've never used psychedelic drugs before. And I'm just wondering whether both the behavioral and personality measures and neural effects might be exaggerated by these selection criteria.
Well, I'll start by saying I think they probably are. I think there are the selection biases probably well, I'd certainly say in my study we have psychedelic experience, so we're reducing the risk of adverse events by doing that. But I defend that by saying that the reason we did that was a safety consideration. We were looking at the imaging. It's going to be a different story when we do a study in depressed patients. It's much more likely we're going to have adverse events, and it's a real serious undertaking, and we've got to be ready for how we deal with those adverse events.
I would love to do more research to kind of parse out these mechanisms of participant expectation, the expectation of the experimenters, all of that. But at this point, the people who want to fund this research want to know certain big questions first, and they care less about the mechanism, and the government doesn't care about any of it. So I would love to see a day when just these basic science questions can be asked and you can manipulate expectation and all of the things that we know must be contributing to some kind of bias in the results. But for now, we kind of can't, we just have to kind of keep track of all of these things and hopefully eventually be able to research them.
I was wondering, there is this saying that you need to have a strong ego to be able to let go of ego, and you've kind of been touching on that quite a bit, and if you would like to elaborate on the risks for people with poor ego boundaries and differences between psychosis and mystical experiences.
Do you want to do that?
I was chuckling because that is, so the clinical director of our study, Bill Richards, that's his favorite phrase. But I don't know much about the ego. I'm sure Robin does know more about it, but I wonder if that's true because I guess it's hard to say I know what a strong ego is in some conceptions in psychology, but I don't know that ego development, moral development, all of these kind of trajectories have anything to do with whether someone can have, in our way of looking at it, a mystical experience. I think it's more biologically normal to have an experience like that, and it depends less on how kind of advanced or developed you are in various other ways. And there are actually other people in the audience who are experts on this very question. I think Jeffrey Martin is one of them, but I only saw 15 minutes worth of his knowledge, so I'm sure he's thought a lot about this idea of development versus a particular experience.
I'm struck by the similarities and differences, both experientially and neurally and neurotransmitter-wise, between dreaming and taking psilocybin. In other words, yes, when we dream, we have the best and sometimes the worst experiences of our lives. The serotonergic system is very much affected when we are in REM sleep dreaming. Part of the default mode network system is disconnected. The medial prefrontal cortex is active during dreaming, but the posterior cingulate cortex and the precuneus are off on a break, coffee breaks, they're offline. So it's just like, have you thought about that? Would you like to look and see how come there are these similarities? The medial prefrontal cortex is alive and well, but the rest of the DMN is not.
Yeah.
And I guess experientially, there are these similarities and differences.
Yeah.
So I'm asking, have you thought about it? And do you think it would be useful to see about making comparisons, similarities, and differences?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've thought about it a lot. Actually, the idea I came to my boss with when I wanted to do a PhD was to look at to compare the neurobiology with imaging of REM sleep and the psychedelic state, because the phenomenology is being compared. There is some evidence to support that the biology is similar, and actually. There are some studies from the 60s where LSD was given shortly before sleep onset, or actually in one case infused during sleep, and it significantly decreased the latency to REM sleep. So essentially it, significantly promoted REM sleep and dreaming. Actually, in one case there was awakening as well. So I think it's a very strong hypothesis that I really want to test. Dream imaging studies are especially difficult to do, but there's definitely place for some new studies imaging dreaming. And personally, I'm trying to work that collaboration actually, but it's difficult and there's a lot going on at the moment. So.
Okay, we're running out of time. We'll take a few more questions.
I wanted to ask about the long-term effects that seem very fascinating, where you actually have long-term effects in the last 14 months, and it seems as though post-traumatic stress disorder and psilocybin produce exactly the opposite long-term effect. And I wonder if there was some common mechanism, if you'd want to speculate on it, and also if you think that it may have something to do with epigenetics, meaning Christopher Badcock's The Imprinted Brain. He talks about that a little bit. So there's some kind of cluster of epigenetic genes that could be responsible for both when it comes to long-term effects.
So I've been thinking more and more about biological mechanism and possibly epigenetic mechanisms for different kind of timescales of change, both in the work I'm doing with meditation and with psilocybin. I think that will bring us closer to a mechanism for why it seems that certain time-limited experiences can have such a long effect. That's actually a kind of a radical notion that you can change the brain and your genetic expression over such a short time scale. But I think more and more we're seeing that all sorts of interventions that just haven't really been studied yet can do that. So it's not, it could be at the level of psychology, and I think that beliefs and values and attitudes and behaviors matter a lot, but you are also fundamentally changing the brain and physiology, I think, in the long run. Maybe it's an easier case to make with meditation, because there's been tons of work done showing neuroplastic changes in healthy adults there. Not anything so far on epigenetics, although I don't want to break his cover, but Richie Davidson showed some data at the Center for Mindfulness meeting a few weeks ago showing epigenetic changes with meditation. So I think it's coming, it's on the horizon.
Two very quick questions, one for each of you. For Robin, what did you use to measure functional connectivity? Was it dynamic causal modeling pioneered at UCL, or was it some kind of, or have you tried any kind of multimodal imaging, DSPM or something to co-register with MEG or EEG or anything else?
We definitely want to do DCM, dynamic causal modeling, and it's, we haven't done that. It was seed-based functional connectivity, so just looking at essentially the coupling between different regions in the brain. So we did seed-based, but with the between network connectivity that I showed, we did seed-based and we also did ICA, and there were consistent findings with both. But DCM gives you an added bit of information, and it's a potentially really powerful tool. It's hard to understand. I have to be honest and say there's difficult analysis to understand, but I think it's a really important one to do, and we certainly will do that.
Okay, and for Katherine, in all the subjects that you've tried, do you see anything that's a contraindication for a 64-year-old introverted male?
That particular demographic is probably very similar to many people who've gone through our studies. I would say the serious contraindication is any family history of schizophrenia or psychotic versions of various mental disorders. We screen out not only first-degree relative, but second-degree relative with any kind of schizoaffective, even a suggestion of a possible diagnosis or maybe undiagnosed. There's a possibility, and it's not just psychedelics, but marijuana too, exposure to certain drugs can trigger psychosis, and I guess you could get to a certain age at which that's no longer a big risk, but we avoid it entirely. And I would say that there have been probably a few volunteers who maybe had made it through screening, had a fine time, but had some of the kind of paranoia and delusions come up. And I'm interested in whether maybe there's some family history genetic component there that we missed or that didn't come up in a diagnosis that they knew of. I do think that that will prove to be effective in predicting why some people have really classic bad trips or triggered psychosis that really kind of jars everything loose rather than produces adaptive changes.
Okay, I know there are a lot more questions, but we're really running. I have about 10 myself about quantum effects. I know I'm getting to you. So the lady in blue will have the last word.
Okay. Oh, thank goodness. So this is for Katherine. So first a story and then a question. So I have a friend, and when she was in her teens, in her youth, experimented with psilocybin and had a number of mystical experiences. And since then, at random occasions, has been able to return to that same sense of feeling without any drug-induced or any meditation. And so I'm wondering about, the question is, any studies that you have or long-term studies about how that might affect your ability to get into that, have that another mystical experience subsequently.
I mean, I do think it gives you familiarity with the subjective experience. I think there's a more solid claim that possibly if you're doing some kind of induction like meditation, that would be more likely. But I'm thinking that in the placebo research, if someone has already had an experience with a drug and then you give them a placebo and tell them it's the drug, they'll have a stronger placebo effect. So, you know, more familiarity, you can kind of fill in the gaps more. In terms of actual data, though, the only thing that's really been looked at is the kind of visual perceptual disturbances that some people seem to get even after they've stopped taking psychedelics. And Matt Baggett did a 15,000-person survey and showed that basically the more you took psychedelics, the more likely you were to report having those persistent visual disturbances. And it was mostly LSD and not the other drugs. So no one's really looked at these other kind of domains. I think it's quite possible.
This person turned out to be a long-distance runner or a runner, and after a period of long running, you know, like a half marathon or so, and then subsequently was able to
lose that sense of self and feel subsequently interconnected with everything and have that same experience kind of come back on them. So I'm just...
Well, yeah, long-term running is a pretty good way to produce changes in consciousness, so...
Okay.
All right, thank you all. Let's thank our speakers for an excellent closing session.